We strongly recommend you have a seat cushion from our friendly front-of-house staff. There are 2 wheelchair-accessible washrooms on this level, adjacent to the main entrance, and there are additional facilities on the church's lower level. In the highly unlikely event of an emergency, there are exits in each corner of the sanctuary leading to sidewalk, garden, and Highway 10. But please use the highway side doors only in an emergency. Lastly, the usual friendly reminder and admonition about phones and other noisemakers. Thank you. We acknowledge with respect the history, spirituality, and culture of the Anishinaabe, 6 Nations of the Grand River, Haudenosaunee, and Wendat Wyandot peoples, on whose traditional territories we gather and whose ancestors signed treaties with our ancestors. We also recognize the Métis and Inuit whose ancestors shared this land and these waters. May we all, as treaty people, live with respect on this land and live in peace and friendship with all its diverse peoples.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Welcome to this very special evening, as tonight we introduce a captivating book, which is a historical/biographical account of one of Canadians' experience during the Second World War, the War Diaries of Louis E. Wren. Once again, welcome and thank you for joining us on this auspicious day. This day, the 3rd of September, is significant in that 21 years ago, the Canadian government formally recognized the contributions of some 12,000 Canadian and Newfoundland merchant sailors who during World War II made some 25,000 voyages across the Atlantic Ocean on over 400 ships, voyages which were a lifeline to the desperate peoples overseas. Today, on Merchant Navy Veterans Day, we remember and thank veterans of the Merchant Navy who served in the defense of Canada, lest we forget. The War Diaries of Louis E. Wren is not simply a historical account. It is an homage paid to a father by his son. That son is this evening's presenter, Chris Wren. Before Chris starts his presentation, allow me to tell you a little bit about him. Chris, not unlike many baby boomers, is a Renaissance man, a person of varied interests, abilities, commitments, and experience. Like those of us in his age demographic, he is retired. Retired, yes, but not out to pasture. Chris spent his early years in Guelph and attended the University of Guelph. At the University of Guelph, he received a Bachelor of Science degree in 1977 and a doctorate PhD degree in 1983. I have something that I want to show you. The notice of his oral exam was printed in the university newsletter called the Guelph News Bulletin. And I quote, this is what it writes about Chris. The final oral examination for the degree of Doctor of Philosophy for Chris Wren, Zoology, is Tuesday, April 19th at 9 a.m. in room 168, Botany and Genetics Zoology Building. His thesis title is Examination of the Environmental Effects, the Distribution of Mercury and Other Metals in the Precambrian Shield Lake Ecosystems. Professor Hugh McCrinnan is his supervisor. I thought that was interesting, but then I read something else even more interesting later on. Other interesting articles at the end of this newsletter listed things that I, as a Guelph student, remember reading about and was really interested in. I wasn't so interested in who was getting his PhD at that time. I was an undergrad. I wasn't interested in whether the dean had a social and somebody got a gavel or somebody visited from some other country. These are things I was interested in, and a lot of our students were. So here's what it wrote. Available, neat, fast typing, IBM Selectric. Now, those of you of my generation who went through high school and did not take typing as an option in high school regret it today because the computer came along. At that time, it was something that the ladies, the girls took. Guys didn't take typing. We took mechanics, we took music, we took art, instruments, things like that. But we get it now. The other one was available, neat, fast typing in the IBM Selectric. There was childcare available. Wanted, a cottage to rent on Georgian Bay. Cassette tape recorder for sale. And my favorite in this article was, for sale, a yellow-fronted Amazon parrot with a cage, 4.5 years old, good talker, no profanity. And it's in the article. Chris went on to become a lecturer at Laurentian University in Sudbury, a prolific report writer specializing in subjects such as, and these are really exciting for those that are laymen, the review of metal toxicity and accumulation in mammals. As a member of the Society of Environmental Toxicology and Chemistry, Chris wrote about environmental risk assessments and environmental human interventions and the results thereof. With his wife, Lisa, he established an environmental consultancy firm. Chris was also involved in the accommodation reviews which led to preventing the Blue Water District School Board's proposed closure of Beavercrest Public School in Markdale and the construction of the new state-of-the-art facility in Markdale. His current community involvement includes serving as a director of the Bruce Gray Child and Family Services Board. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, please welcome our guest and presenter, Chris Wren.
Thank you very much, Terry. Before we get started, I will give a few acknowledgments. The first, of course, to Terry Mokry for that very generous introduction. And Terry works very hard at these introductions. I've seen him do it a few times because most of what he said I never told him about. So I don't know where he got all that information. I'd also like to thank Dave and Dale Armstrong, of course, for being great supporters. Dave's been great in helping advertise, and Dale for arranging all the coffee and snacks, and to Ainsley Church, of course. Tim Riley upstairs behind the scenes. He's putting his hands up, doing all the audio-visual, and we couldn't manage without him. Kevin Lamb, sitting selling books, and proprietor of Speaking Volumes Bookstore in Markdale here, a wonderful treasure. If you haven't been there, please, in fact, visit the store. And last but not least, of course, my wife Lisa, who helped format all my slides. She looked at my presentation on the weekend, said, "Here, move aside and let me have a go at it for a few hours." So it looks much better from her involvement. Now, hopefully, this will work. There, we got the first slide. Lisa and I discovered, almost exactly 20 years ago since we discovered the little area of Glenelg and the wonderful hamlet of Traverston, and we moved here and we haven't looked back. Both Lisa and our daughter Robin are here tonight. He's embarrassed. But we're very proud to call Markdale our home and very pleased to be part of this community. My sister Melody and her husband Jeff are here tonight from Guelph, and of course the story about our father is her story as well. However, being in a church, I feel a little awkward talking about our father. I figure people might get mixed up, or Catholics are going to start crossing themselves or something. So I'll probably continue to refer to him as my father, Melody, or in a lot of the slides and in the book, in the third person, I refer to him by his initials, L-E-W. And I also generally will just refer to him as Dad, because he'll always be my dad, even though I'm now older than he ever got to be. A little bit of background. Of course, we've talked the book And I guess this is a book launch evening. This is the first talk I've given about it, so bear with me a few rusty spots. On the left is a picture of the actual journals of my father that we found after he had passed away. The one on the left is his time in the Merchant Navy, and although it was relatively short, you'll soon see it was a very intense period of time. And the one on the right covered some of his time in the Royal Air Force, and there was a period of about 2 years between the two journals. There was likely another journal, but if there was, we never found it, and it's one of those mysteries. We'll round out the talk at the very end. Of course, today, as Terry said, is Merchant Navy Day, so we'll focus on the Merchant Navy this evening and round out with a few comments on the Royal Air Force at the end, just to round the story out. On the right, of course, a picture of Dad in a naval uniform, double-breasted, and an anchor on the cap. It's a studio photograph, obviously, and it's the only one we have of him actually in the Merchant Navy or in a naval uniform. Don't worry, we have lots of pictures for in the presentation as well. Just a few things I just want to make sure I don't forget at the beginning, and then the rest, it doesn't matter. So as I said, it's the only photograph we have in the Navy. Like many veterans, Dad did not talk a lot about the war, but he did make a lot of comments that I seem to take to heart and remember and recall a few of them. But we never had a conversation, and what I wouldn't give to be able to do that now, of course. When the war broke out, he was already in the Merchant Navy. One of the things we'll speculate on is how he got there or why. And it was before war broke out, but I remember our mother kind of ruefully saying, "Of course your father signed up and volunteered before the war even started." I don't think she was all that impressed. So how did he get there or why? Perhaps we can look at his parents for a glimpse of and speculate. This is his parents, our grandparents, who we never met, Arthur and Lillian Wren. Arthur was a volunteer in Lord Kitchener's army that when it was determined that the First World War was not going to be over fast, Lord Kitchener put a call out for volunteers, and Edward was amongst the first. They were in the 9th Division, went to France in May of 1915 and stayed the duration of the war. And I was looking at some maps of troop deployment in the battles, and I realized that the 9th Division fought right alongside the Canadians at Vimy Ridge in April 1917. Of course, the Canadians taking Vimy Ridge was a real defining moment in our history. Although it's primarily talk about British, I'll make a number of comments about the Canadians in the war, because I'm a very proud Canadian. So he was a volunteer, and he stayed until the end of the war in 1918. Lillian is in uniform of the Women's Legion, which was a women's volunteer group of over 40,000 ladies in and around London primarily, and she's in the uniform of the Motor Transport Division of the Army Service Corps. So she was a driver. My mother often commented that our grandmother was an ambulance driver in the First World War, so it was almost accurate, although she would never have met Lillian. But to be a woman driving in 1915 must have been quite an event. Of course, she was not allowed to vote, but she could do that. So the fact that they were both volunteers may have been some inspiration for Dad volunteering in the Second World War or before it started. And also on Lillian's birth certificate and marriage certificate, her father's occupation was listed as a barge master and master mariner. So perhaps Dad heard some stories about the sea and merchant navy from his mother. But again, he never got to meet his own grandfather. Terry's talked about the merchant navy. The term was conferred upon the merchant sailors by King George after the First World War in recognition of their contribution. And they sailed under something called the Red Duster. They had their own flag, and Dad mentioned it in his diaries, and I had to look it up. I didn't know what that was. And it was a red flag with the Union Jack in the corner. And in fact, after Germany invaded a number of the European countries, merchant ships from countries like France, Denmark, Belgium, they would fly the Red Duster to show their allegiance to the Allies. As Terry pointed out, Merchant Navy Day became an official day of remembrance about 25 years ago. I think a little different from what you said, perhaps. And there's different statistics on how many Canadian merchant sailors died throughout the war. I have one figure of 2,000 during the war, and is a higher percentage of casualties than any other branch of the Canadian services. And I'm not trying to downplay anything, but it was much higher than the Air Force, the Army, or the Canadian Navy. And there's different statistics, and they're all quite appalling. So you had a much higher risk if you're in the merchant Navy than in the regular services. And yet, merchant seafarers were not given official recognition as veterans until 1992 and did not receive any compensation until 55 years after the war ended. And that's, of course, does not seem right, but that has been turned over. But by then, many of the veterans would have been perished or gone. Dad served aboard a tanker called the motor vessel Corbus. I looked it up finally, and Corbus is actually a Latin noun for meaning a basket or a vessel for containing things, so it's a perfect name for a tanker. It was owned by the Anglo-Saxon Petroleum Company, which is now part of the Shell Corporation. It was built in Belfast, Ireland by the same shipyard that was very famous, built the Titanic some 20 years earlier. The size and the dimensions don't mean a lot, but I just try and put things in perspective. It was, I'm going to use imperial, it was 465 feet long, which seems pretty big. But if you think about the Edmund Fitzgerald, we all know about that. That was over 700 feet long. Many of the Great Lakes freighters today are pushing 1,000 feet. So 465 feet traveling around the oceans of the world is not that big. Top speed, it was 11 knots or nautical miles per hour. Again, it's not that exciting. It's only 13 miles an hour, which is not very quick when you got 3,000 miles of ocean to cover. And it also becomes relevant when we start talking about the convoys and the U-boats and the battleships that were chasing the convoys. Cargo, of course, with crude oil, gasoline, and naphtha in barrels. You don't have to use much of imagination to know what would happen to that if you were hit by a torpedo. And tankers, of course, were primary targets by the U-boats. Dad was one of the engineers. There were several engineers. Even though the ship was just 10 years old, or not even, the ships they run are 24/7, 365 days a year, so the engineers are on shift round the clock, and there's many, he's talking about changing valves, pumps, pistons, everything. And of course, if you're out at sea, you're not calling for parts, you're machining them and making them yourself. It was essentially unarmed. I say essentially because he does mention that there was a machine gun on board with some gunners. What a machine gun was supposed to do against some of the U-boat or battleships, I have no idea. He did make an entry that one day they were having target practice and they threw a barrel overboard, and the breech of the machine gun blew up, and it was a miracle nobody was killed, and the barrel got away unscathed. You know. I'm not going to talk about many ships in detail, but I want to mention the steamship Athenia. It was the first ship casualty of the war, and in fact, it was hit less than 10 hours after the war. It was declared, England declared war on Germany today, September 3rd, 86 years ago. So the U-boats were already out in the Atlantic in position waiting for Allied ships. It was hit by 2 torpedoes at 1940 hours, which is about 20 minutes from now. And the captain of the U-boat 30 quickly learned that he had hit an unarmed passenger ship, which was against the convention at the time when the Athenia started radioing distress signals back to England. He did not report. Fortunately, the Athenia stayed afloat for another 14 hours, so most of the Almost 1,500 passengers were saved, but over 117 passengers and the crew were killed. The captain, Lemp, of the U-boat did not report this by radio. He knew that he had made a mistake. In fact, he did not tell anybody till he got back to Germany some 3 weeks later, and he was told to be quiet. They altered the logs on the ship to pretend they were never in the area. He was sent to see Hitler himself in Berlin, who told everybody to keep it quiet, because amongst the people killed were a number of Americans, and they were very afraid of bringing the United States into the war. And in fact, the Nazi propaganda machine went into action and actually put out lots of articles saying that Churchill had ordered the sinking of the Athenia to bring the Americans in. Now, Churchill did many things, but he would not have done that. Thus, as was talked about by Ted Barris a couple of years ago in Fleshington, this begins the Battle at the Atlantic, which many people have heard about, that lasted every day of the duration of the war, Second World War. There's many photos. This is a great poster, War Gardens. In 1939, Britain was importing 20 million tons of food a year to support themselves. If you put that in terms of ships, it's several thousand ships just of food. Rationing began in 1940, a few months into the war, and lasted into the 1950s. Perhaps a lot of people don't realize that. And the citizens were encouraged to grow their own food and vegetables. And I have to give a nod to a lot of the farmers in this room and the parents of farmers. Some people might recognize that combine. We've all seen signs that farmers feed cities, well, they feed countries as well. And Canadian farmers made great contribution to the war effort. And people like our neighbor and good friend Ron Torrey, his father, who trained and actively trained for service and was prepared to go overseas, was told to stay back and farm. Your job was very, very important. And they did that. So they made great strides. And when labor was short, because a lot of young men did go overseas, of course, the women stepped into, as they always do, to help out. But a great effort there. And there's a little girl in a pink dress in that comma who might be here tonight. How did all that food get from Canada, or all those supplies? It wasn't just food, it was oil, it was arms, it was metals, it was medicine, it was everything. Of course, they got across on these Atlantic convoys. The first convoy they were from Halifax, they convoyed up, assembled in Halifax, and went to Liverpool. The first one, HX1, it's not a hard code, H for Halifax and X, I think, for Express. Left just not even 2 weeks after the war started, September 16th. Dad was in convoy HX7, so that was one of the early convoys, and later in HX 70 and 90. The HX convoys were expected to sail at a minimum of 9 knots. So again, not very fast, but they were called the fast convoys. The SC, or slow convoys, there's not a hard code here, sailed at 7 to 7.5 knots. There was a total of 377 convoys, quite a large number. About 10% of the convoys were attacked, which may not seem that high, but when the convoys were attacked, they often suffered very high loss. And Dad was in HX 70 and 90, and both of those were attacked by U-boats, and we'll mention those a little bit more later. I'm going to spend a few minutes on this slide. I should have probably had a couple of slides. Again, there's lots of information out on the escorts during the war, and the Canadian Navy played a great role in that. There's a great movie with Tom Hanks called Greyhound, based on a book, and it's an actual about a destroyer escort for a Halifax to Liverpool convoy, and it's a good movie. But when war broke out, there were not many escorts. Canadian Navy was kind of caught with their pants down, to be honest. We only had 13 warships, and that's between the Atlantic and the Pacific. The Royal Navy was needed to protect England, so they didn't have a lot of ships to spare. Of course, the Americans did not join the war for another 2 years. So there was not a lot of escort service. I put in here convoys just to remind me, it's like a flock of sheep. So to be in a tight formation like this by all these very independent captains and sailors is just the paradox. They don't want to do that kind of thing. They're used to sailing the seven seas by themselves. So to be in formation was nerve-wracking alone, let alone being under attack at times. And I say they're like a flock of sheep. So if there was an escort or two escorts, if a U-boat came in and hit one ship, the escorts would go skirting off trying to track down that U-boat or whatever it was and leave the rest of the convoy unprotected. So the analogy is good. I have two terms called stragglers and rompers. The stragglers often, again, I referred to the mechanical difficulties. Ships often had mechanical problems. Dad refers to their own ship, limping along on one engine, so they would fall behind the convoy. They were a straggler, and they were a primary target for the U-boats. The U-boats waited for the ships to come out of the convoy, just like a sheep coming out of the flock. They're easy prey. So they were stragglers, and they tried to keep up. And rompers, sometimes when the convoys were attacked, if there's a captain of a ship, a merchant ship that was relatively fast, he would say, I'm getting out of here, and they make a run for it themselves. They make a break. So the Admiralty called them rompers, and they let them go, and they had mixed success on getting away. So most ships stayed in convoy. This is not a book reading per se. I don't think, I've never been to a book reading, but I do have a number of slides with passages from the journals because I think we hear from Dad's own words what it was like at times. I put this one here because this is the very first entry. It's abbreviated in the first journal, the first page. And it's already November, so he's been in the Merchant Navy for a few months while the war has already been on. And Purfleet is a location just below London on the Thames River. So we shifted from Purfleet at 1 p.m. The captain came along to my cabin and we had a talk. He's Welsh. Connie left for her sisters, Connie, my mother, at 12:40 p.m. I think she was glad to go after messing about for 3 days. The orders are for 7 p.m. tomorrow, but the old man has to attend a conference, so I doubt we'll go before. The river, Thames, is chock-a-block with ships here of all sizes and shapes. There must be 200 or 300 between here and Gravesend. A second Sparks joined us today. So the old man is the affectionate term they always call the captain. And the fact that the captain dropped into Dad's room or cabin demonstrates the not very much hierarchy in the Merchant Navy. There'd be the captain and the officers, and they would chum around together, not like the regular Navy. And also the Sparks joined today. Sparks is a term called for the radio operator, the wireless as it's referred to, and they were instrumental in both communications and also in navigation. We'll hear more about that later, and using directional finding and for radio beacons to figure out where they were on their journeys. Convoy formation. This on the right is an actual wireless message that was taped into Dad's journal, and it shows the shape of of a convoy. In the early period, the convoys were 35 ships or less, because again, the Admiralty just literally did not think that the merchant sailors could control themselves, or they could not control more than 35 ships. This is convoy HG, not important, but that means homeward bound from Gibraltar. This was January 1940. Dad's ship is the Corbus here. And the convoys were wider than they were long generally because the U-boats wanted to attack the broadside from the sides, so they tried to make the convoys relatively short. And this is no exception. So this convoy it was in the Mediterranean, leaving from Gibraltar. It actually had 15 merchant ships and 2 escorts. Some of the early routes, I mean pre-1940, some of the destinations they would leave, of course, London is out of the just outside here. They would pass through the Straits of Gibraltar and go through the Mediterranean. They would often put in at Haifa, which was Palestine at the time, before Israel was a country. They'd pick up oil. They would also go through the Dardanelles Straits to Constanza in Romania. Of course, this area is still in the news today because Ukraine is right just there. They would often, generally, bring their cargoes back and bring it to the Seine River in France, because the British Army was still in France at the time. This was before Dunkirk. So the Army needed oil, and that's where their destination was. I say pre-1940 because then after the Germans invaded France, they got through Europe. Italy joined the war in June of 1940, and they had control of much of North Africa, so the Mediterranean effectively became closed to Allied shipping. Some more journal excerpts. Early in the war near Halifax, Nova Scotia, we were playing Chase Me with German subs, and we've won so far. A high-stake game. You're being a bit cocky there, I think. A submarine was reported near their convoy. We have instructions not to show any lights. I'm just about to turn in, and I don't know if I'll get up for sure. You can read the rest. In their convoy, H-70, which Judy was our sister and Connie my mother. The approach in the United Kingdom in convoy H-70 had some hellish rough seas. A plane attacked us and set fire to a tanker, the Regent Lion. Saw another ship hit with after end blown off with lots of life lost. And in lots of books about the Battle of Atlantic, you can look these convoys up. You can look up the Regent Lion, and it's all on the internet now. Dad would be amazed what's available. Weather was next to farmers. I think sailors worry about the weather as much as anybody. The convoy conditions in January, it's the middle of the winter. They've just left Liverpool. It's still freezing. Sleet is blowing horizontally like bullets. Visibility is very bad. It's very trying, this convoy business. We are apprehensive of mines, torpedoes, and collisions. If we sank, we couldn't launch a boat in these seas. If we took to the drink, we should perish of exposure. So we are in a spot. Typical British understatement, in a spot, I'll say. He mentions collisions. I omitted to say that. Again, if they were caught in fog or in storms, collisions between the ships occurred. When the convoy got attacked by U-boats, it often threw panic into the ships, and there was many collisions between merchant ships, and also between merchant ships and their escorts. The escorts would try and go tearing through the convoy, and there was many collisions. And again, the other thing that the convoys did during the daytime was zigzag, and Dad refers to that a lot. So the convoys would go on a zigzag pattern to try and throw off the U-boats that were tracking them. They did not do that at nighttime because that would be very challenging. Rough weather again, just the next day. We had very, very rough weather as we came into the Atlantic. Excuse me. You can read them. So the destroyer dropped a depth charge. Obviously, thinking a U-boat or a submarine was very close. As I write this ship, the ship is rolling heavily, and the chair I'm in keeps tipping over. I feel ill and apprehensive. Spencer Dunmore, who was a Canadian historian out of Burlington, actually, in his book on the Battle of the Atlantic, he stated, weather was an implacable enemy in the early months of 1940 in the Battle of the Atlantic. So, who were chasing the convoys? The convoy hunters. The primary threat were U-boats. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. There's lots of information. U-boat stands as a Canadian or an English abbreviation for undersea boat, the German. They could do, these are general, of course, their technology and the U-boats got better and better and faster throughout the war. Generally, they could do about 17 knots on the surface, again, faster than the merchant ships, and they could keep up to a slow convoy, even underwater. They were equipped with 10 to 16 torpedoes, which they tried to save as much as possible. They would use those if they were attacking a convoy, but if they came upon a straggler or an individual merchant ship, they would use their deck guns to sink the ship. And they started to hunt in what they called wolf packs. So again, the analogy to a flock of sheep is not lost. The other threats were called surface raiders. They were a pocket battleship. So this is one of the most famous, the Admiral Graf Spee. And they were built and designed to sink merchant ships. Very quick for a ship of their size. They could do 28 knots. And they were designed to actually outrun most of the Allied or British battleships that were sent to try and sink these guys. The commander Hans Langsdorff, we'll talk about him. He was very efficient, and by the first few months of 1939, he had sank 11 merchant ships in the first few months before he was actually caught and his ship was destroyed in Uruguay. The thing outstanding about Langsdorff is that although he sank 11 ships, he never killed a single person or sailor. He would approach the ships, order their surrender, shoot the aerials down, so they couldn't radio for help, and tell the crew and the captain to abandon ship and get into lifeboats. He would take the captain and the officers prisoner on his own ship, and they were treated very well. The other crew were usually either put in lifeboats and sent off. Langsdorff would radio their position to whoever was out there so that they would be rescued, and then he would take off. A lot of the crew were collected by a supply ship of the Graf Spee called the Altmark, had over 300 merchant crew prisoners on it before it was finally tracked down and captured and everyone rescued. It's quite a story. It's a very fantastic story. Langsdorff, his ship was, the Graf Spee was damaged in battle. He ran into a neutral harbor in Uruguay, and under the rules of the time, they could stay there for 72 hours, and the British couldn't follow him in. There was some decency, I guess. He knew he could not return to Germany or get through the British blockade, so he took his ship and scuttled it, or sank it, in the mouth of the River Platte. He went back to his hotel room and shot himself, which is somewhat of a sad ending to a guy who's received honor on both sides of the sides. But it was also a huge relief to the merchant ships that this surface raider was out of the way. And Dad, again, in his diary, when he was in Uruguay picking up oil, commented that they saw the wreck of the Graf Spee, and that would have been quite an event for them. I put this in not to that I want anybody to memorize this, but it's to show that during just a few months into the war, from about April to September, was a very busy, intense time of the war. During the early part, the ship was in the Mediterranean. In May, it was in France, just weeks before Germany overran France. April to June, of course, Germany overran most of Europe. Italy joined the war on the German side when they thought Hitler was going to be successful. Mussolini jumped on board. Churchill became prime minister. And then, of course, they had early June evacuation of troops from Dunkirk, which, although it was a very successful operation, as Churchill pointed out, wars are not won by retreating. And it must have been a huge blow to the British confidence. And again, Dad remarks on this in his journals, and it must have been quite depressing. Hitler prepares for the invasion of England, and by July 10th, as the Battle of Britain begins, of course, that's the battle for air supremacy. Hermann Göring told Hitler that he could smash the Royal Air Force in a couple of weeks and leave the path clear for his army to invade England. Fortunately, that did not happen. During that period, Corbus went on a long trip through the Atlantic. So again, the Mediterranean as a source of oil was closed off. So the ships would, in this case, left London, pass through the Azores, come all the way down to Buenos Aires, pick up oil, and then they spent some time in the Dutch West Indies. Then they would go up to Bermuda. The Bermuda they would convoy up, and they would become a BX convoy. Go up to Halifax, convoy up, assemble, and then go over to Liverpool. So a very long trip. 2 days into this voyage, it's off the Lizard, which is the last point of land in England you see when you're departing. Dad says, "This is the biggest convoy I've ever seen. There are about 50 ships. They cover the sea as far as the eye can see. We are the 5th ship in the first column. I'm always thinking of the time I'll get home to Connie and Judy. God keep them safe." And being the 5th ship means he was 5th back from the front, but in the first column, they were the column on the left hand, on the port side. They were most exposed. So I'm actually surprised they would put a tanker on the exposed side. And on that trip, Dad was at sea for 130 days. Tim? Yeah, there we go. This is a bit hard to see, but I'll try and hopefully sorry. Back here. Did we just miss a? Okay, no. And during that time at sea, just again, some of the comments in the journal, July 4th, they expect an attempted invasion at home any time now. That must have been heartbreaking to think of that. And then a few weeks later, I've been very lazy over my diary this last few days. Maybe it's a waste of time anyway. I may have to throw it overboard. Keeping a journal or a diary was generally discouraged or not permitted, and if they were attacked or captured, he would have to get rid of his diary. So it's feeling a bit futile. This again, I'll talk about this. There is something called the Black Gap or the Air Gap in the Atlantic Ocean, the first few years of the war. So this was Halifax. The convoy route took them up here, north of Ireland, back to Liverpool. This dotted line is the extent of air cover of aircraft could cover the convoys from Newfoundland. This was the approximate limit from Iceland and approximate limit from Great Britain. In here, in the first few years of the war, there was no air cover, and of course aircraft were essential for protecting the convoys. So this became known as the Black Pit or the Black Gap, and of course the U-boats knew that, and that's where they concentrated a lot of their activity. And that was not closed until May of 1943. From June about 1940 to 41, the U-boat commanders, and this is referred in many books on the Battle of the Atlantic, they referred to this time as the happy time due to their feeling of invincibility and their high rate of success in sinking the merchant ships. And of course, again, Dad was in one of these convoys in August of 1940 during that period. Some statistics on Allied shipping losses, which are just amazing. This is Allied shipping, not just from the Battle of the Atlantic, but merchant ships in general. So 1930, 40, 41, it's creeping up, and it peaks in 1942 at almost 4 ships being sunk a day. And the Admiralty, this panicked the British Admiralty. They could not sustain that. They could not replace the ships at that rate. It dropped off precipitously in 43 due to closing the air gap, better technology, radar on the ships, and experience of the escorts. They just got better at figuring out what the U-boats could and could not do. In total, over 5,400 ships were sunk. Incredible numbers when you think about it. I think the good news is probably over 90% of the ships did get through. But again, the ships, when the convoy was hit, they lost a very high proportion often. And again, over 30,000 British merchant sailors were killed and over almost 6,000 taken prisoners. The graph here is U-boat losses, and it kind of is the opposite trend of the merchant navy, or the Allied shipping. Relatively low losses in 41, 42, Then by 43, as they put it, the hunters became the hunted. The Allies figured out how to get them. They had broken the Enigma code, and they could track down the U-boats. So 43 and 44, high losses of U-boats, and of course this only represents 5 months. In fact, the Allies sank, I think, 75% of the U-boats and killed over 75% of their sailors. A huge loss. It was the highest casualty rate in any unit of service on either side of throughout the war. I'll let you read this. That's quite a statement from everything he had been through the war to say that this was the thing that frightened him the most. In the journals, Dad makes several references to listening and hearing Churchill's speech while they're out at sea. I looked up those speeches, and I've included excerpts and parts of those speeches in the book. I think they're wonderful. They're very powerful. And it was not all rough times. Sailors in port, and here's one entry, and there's many. Bill and I went for a walk in the afternoon. We went through a small village and up a country lane. They're in France. We were stopped by a French soldier. We returned and went into a cafe and saw Sparks and the third mate. We had a beer and gin and more. And one of the fellows, the fourth engineer, fell in the dock coming home, and several more got wet through fishing him out. So they were behaving like sailors immemorial. And who wouldn't when you don't know what's going to happen the next day? He often also made some very, poetical or prosaic observations during times of calm. We were off, this in the Mediterranean, we were off Algiers. Saw several little villages on shore with the mountains of French Morocco behind. It's lovely country around here. We were abreast about 6 p.m., and in the dark the whole town was lit up. Low down in the sky and just west of town, a thin new moon hung in a black velvety sky. It was like a scene out of the Arabian Nights. I don't know where he learned to write like that. But he had many entries, or several entries like that, and very detailed observations of inhabitants of ports they put into. And I found they were very, very nicely written. Something that people in here may or may not know, we actually had something called the Battle of the St. Lawrence River. In 1942, the U-boats were very emboldened and powered by their success in the Atlantic, and 6 of them moved into the St. Lawrence, almost as far as Quebec City. They sank over 20 merchant ships and 4 warships in the St. Lawrence. One of them being the SS Caribou, with a loss of over 100 crew and passengers, which was considered the worst disaster of the sea. So by then, obviously, the U-boats had no problems or compulsion about sinking an unarmed passenger ship. So I thought people might be interested in that. In 1940, navigation was often a challenge, and that seems incredible today's day and age when every one of people here can pull out their cell phone and it tells them exactly where you are, where your parked car is, and you have GPS and all sorts of things. They did not even have radar. They had compass and dead reckoning and radio directional finding. There's lots of reference to this. January, we got lost. They're just approaching Liverpool. We got lost this morning. The weather was thick and no stars, could get no bearings. The enemy had laid mines, so we were having a hell of a time. Everyone on board is feeling seedy. I think it's the thought of getting through the minefield. A couple months later, they're in 9 days from Gibraltar. They were to arrive in Brest in France. We had been going to arrive at Brest at 2 a.m., but as usual, we got lost. Sparks took a directional finding bearing at 12:30, but the old man wouldn't believe him. It'd be very uncomfortable to be at sea in the dark or fog or storms, not know exactly where you are. One of the things that struck me the most from the journals was his empathy that he had for the German sailors and the U-boats. On Friday, December 8th, an RAF, a Royal Air Force plane, sank a submarine. The RAF plane hit the sub, which was about to dive with 1 ton of bombs. Poor souls, they would never known what hit him. Several references. January, Hitler is definitely insane. The pity that he sends brave men to their deaths. On Good Friday in 1940, 52 days from home, a German sub was depth charged for half an hour. No trace, presumed sunk. God rest the souls aboard. Well, I feel desperately sorry for the crews of the German submarine. There may be one about to sink us now. Not quite logical, but I'm still sorry for them. He was quite a human being. Convoy HX-90, we're getting near the end here. I mentioned that this was the last convoy that he was in. The Corbus was part of, it was a 40-ship convoy leaving Halifax. Only had 1 escort, which was an unarmed merchant ship, so not very effective escort. And it turned around when they got just over halfway to pick up an escort or a convoy going back to Halifax, which would have been traveling empty. So they were left undefended for over a day. And there was news of the convoy probably leaked out to the Germans. There was lots of spies about, but there's also convoys leaving weekly, so it wasn't a hard thing to figure out. But there was 8 U-boats waiting on the far side of the Atlantic for this convoy. Escorts did arrive the next day, but by then, and the U-boats continued their attack and eventually sank 11 of the 40 ships. There was Bernard Edwards in his book on the Battle of the Atlantic described this convoy and the attack as a massacre. And again, this kind of threw the Admiralty into despair. And my father did once say to me, one of the most horrific sights imaginable is seeing a ship on fire with sailors leaping into the ocean, and your ship is not allowed to stop and pick anyone up. You were just simply not allowed to. You would be hit, probably collided with somebody behind. Your ship would be sitting there stationary, a primary target for the U-boats, so you had to keep going. And I'm sure he was thinking that night in the convoy HX-90. At the end of the war, Rear Admiral Murray, who was Commander-in-Chief, he was the only Canadian ever put in charge of a unit of the armed forces. He remarked, "The Battle of the Atlantic was not won by any Navy or Air Force. It was won by the courage, fortitude, and determination of the British and Allied merchant Navy." Quite a compliment by a Navy man. After the merchant Navy, after that convoy HX-90, he joined the Royal Air Force just the first week into January. And again, I remember Mum saying that he was one of the last people allowed to leave the Merchant Navy. But he commented before that he'd like to have been in the RAF. So he joined the Royal Air Force. The first 2 years he was in England under Bomber Command, and he was trained as a mechanic servicing the ground crew, servicing the engines on Wellington bombers. 1943, there's a few dates kind of collide here, whatever. April 15th, he boarded a troop ship in Liverpool, back to Liverpool, and out to the ocean again, to the Middle East and Africa. And that was a 3-month trip on 3 different troop ships. And if anybody's read it in the journal or will read it, that was quite an interesting voyage. 2 days later was his birthday. He never mentions that in the journal. I would have. He would have been 32 years old, but not mentioned. The next day, his ship, the Corbus, was sunk by U-boat number 180 off South Africa. It was traveling independently by itself, caught fire and sank within 20 minutes. 50 of the crew were killed. There was 10 survivors who were rescued after 2 weeks in an open boat. And interestingly, there's actually a U-boat, U-boat.net website that lists every ship sunk by all the U-boats, and it gives the names of all the crew members that are there. It's quite amazing lot of information. I don't know whether Dad ever excuse me, knew that his ship had been sunk or not. He joined the Royal Air Force. Excuse me. It's just water. Maybe I need something stronger here. he got to North Africa. Of course, the war ended in 1940, or May. He didn't get back home for another 3 months. Things did not happen quickly back in those days. And 2 years later, he emigrated to Canada. He had to come by himself, prove that he could get a job, have somewhere to live, and then he was followed by our mother and older brother and sister 6 months later. Of course, all those journeys were in the Queen Mary or the Queen Elizabeth at the time. No flying back then. I did my own kind of, I don't know if you want to call it a pilgrimage or what. I booked a passenger on a container, a freighter ship, going across the Atlantic in September, 6 years ago now. And we left from Halifax, and I got off in Liverpool, the exact same route as the transport of the convoys 80 years earlier. It was almost anticlimactic. I really enjoyed it. It was great. I'm glad I did it. But we had calm seas. We traveled at 20 knots. We got there in 6.5 days. In fact, the captain had to slow down so we didn't beat the tide coming into Liverpool. Nobody was trying to sink us. So, but it was good. And Liverpool was a wonderful city, some great museums. This is Mom and Dad, 30 years after the war in Guelph. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you for being here.
Hello, my name's Dale Beer. I'm a member here at Annesley, and it's my privilege to thank Chris for a very interesting and informative presentation this evening. And thank you for all of you for being here. Thank you, Chris, for sharing and informing and introducing us to your father, Louis, and his truly remarkable wartime experiences. Moreover, please accept our thanks for your many years of work in the environment, mental research, and for your continued efforts in conservation, and concern for the environment and your community involvement. So thank you again, Chris. Now, Chris will, please. Chris will entertain some questions. I'm not sure how many. Do you have any questions for Chris?
If anybody has any, yeah. But pretty straightforward.
All your questions.
Yeah, perfect. Everybody's ready to go. That's good. Thanks again for coming out. I really appreciate everyone being here.
There are refreshments in the narthex. Please drop by and see Kevin regarding the Chris's book, and we thank you for using Annesley as your book launch site. So thanks so much, Chris, for being here this evening. Yeah. Thank you, and to you all.
Okay. Oh.
Ladies and gentlemen, don't leave, please. Not yet, not for a minute. We have a few thank yous. Dale has mentioned a few of them. We like to acknowledge the support of the book launch by the municipality of Grey Highlands, of course, by Dave and Dale Armstrong and the good folks here at Annesley Church. Let's give them a big round of applause. Chris has already mentioned this, but we cannot help but mention our man above. We don't mean that guy, but the guy in the balcony. Tim Riley of Leaking Ambience Studio in Flesherton, who does all this phenomenal sound and visual work. Let's give Tim a big round of applause. This marks the end of a very special evening with a very special story, which probably resonates in almost each and every one of us, and I know that almost each and every one of us has a story related to a relative or a friend or neighbor who went through something during that period of trial and tribulation in the late 1939 to 45. We'd like to thank each and every one of you for your attendance tonight. But before we leave, let's just take one quick moment in remembrance of all those sailors in the Merchant Navy who served all the Allies during World War II. So if you just bow your heads in a moment of remembrance, please. I know a moment's not enough to remember them by. We keep them in our hearts. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Terry Moker. I was your MC tonight. God bless you. Have a safe trip, and thank you very much for being here.